Okay, so middle range theory, super fun, but it basically exists to fill the gap between what we think is going on in the archaeological record, right? Um, what we use to interpret our data, when we think about. Okay, so here's all these pots. What do all these pots mean? Does it mean this was a kitchen? Does it mean it was a ceremonial place? Does it mean that this was a garbage place? Was it a storage place? Like, what was the purpose, right? So that's the question. We want to know what that is. We want to interpret that thing. But how do we how do we get at what the meaning is? So, middle range theory exists as a way to integrate theory and then empirical research. So, define a link to the past and the present through methodology. And that's going to become a little more clear as we move forward. And I'm going to give you some examples of types of things we do as part of middle range theory. But we're going to do this in a couple of different little videos. And so this first one is just about what middle range theory is and what's the point of it and why we do it. And then we'll talk about a couple different ways to make it happen. So, the whole point of middle range theory, or what it relies upon, is the principle of uniformitarianism, which you may or may not remember from the beginning of the course. Uniformitarianism is actually a geological principle, and what it says is that anything happening currently on the Earth was happening in the past as well. The principle asserting that the processes now operating to modify the Earth's surface are the same processes that operated long ago in the geological past. So, like volcanoes happen now, volcanoes used to happen then. So, the whole point of middle range theory is to find ways to support that this happens culturally as well. It's not just a geological thing. And we use it in biology too, right? So, we talk about how, like with the whole theory of evolution, the idea is that we can see evolution happening in front of us. We know that species are changing and we know why species are changing. We know what natural selection looks like. We are currently living in a time of natural selection, however harsh that may seem. Um, and it is, sorry. But so this, we can see natural selection happening in real time. So we know that it occurs right now as we're living. And then because it's happening now, if we rely on the principle of uniformitarianism, we can apply that it happened in the past. So a lot of times detractors of biological evolution will ask, well, how do we know it happened? Because we weren't there. Well, because we have things like the principle of uniformitarianism, where we understand that things that happen now also happened then. So it's the same idea for archaeology in terms of culture. So we can look at different cultures now and what they should look like in the past and see that cultural practices that happen now were also happening before. And so one of the ways that we link those two things and show the principle of uniformitarianism exists is by using a couple different techniques. So we look for things in ethnoarchaeology, taphonomy, and experimental archaeology. Those are three of our main ways to bridge the past and the present, right? So we use these methods for making bridging arguments. Right, see, bridging arguments, yeah. So these are going to be logical statements based on data that link the pots that we have in the past to the cultural practices that produced that data, right? So we'll use ethnoarchaeology, taphonomy, and experimental archaeology to do those things. So each one of those is gonna get their own separate little video about this, and I'm going to instead move on with talking about the kinds of analogies or the kinds of arguments that you can make to bridge the past and the present using middle range theory. So An analogy refers to similarities between two entities and infers an additional attribute if one is also true of the other. So this means that if you have an archaeological object that has, attributes A, B, C, and D, right? So you have a clay pot that has the same temper and the same pattern on it and the same firing technique, right? All these things are the same. And then ethnographic analogy says that, oh, here's a pot that has all these same things, right? All the same temper, all the same coloring, all the same design. And the function of that is E, right? So the function of that is to be a corn storage pot, or the function of that is to be a chamber pot, right? So therefore, we know from that, right, the archaeological object also has the function of E. So the idea is to find a relationship between modern day form and function from the past. So there's a couple of different ways we can do this. We can do it formally and what we call relationally. So formal analogies, sorry, my dogs are in the house and they're going to make loud noises. So if you heard that big thump, that's just my dog being a clumsy jerk. So formal analogies rely on formal attributes, which means that the physical traits of it means it's going to be about the physical traits of the artifact or the feature. Two objects or contexts share physical appearance or shape. They will share other properties and functions. So that's basically what I was just talking about, right? An analogy being like, oh, this clay pot has the same color and the same temper and the same design on it, and it was made the same way, so it must have the same function that it currently does in a modern indigenous culture. So this is really that was really a formal analogy that I gave a minute ago. So this is even stronger. There's a similar pattern across multiple cultures. So manos and metates, for example, are used not just in Latin American cultures, but in several other cultures where you have a flat stone that's used for grinding on, right, grinding material on. And we see that in a variety of cultural settings. So this is a formal analogy, right? We know what those kinds of things were used for in the archaeological record, because we saw manos and metates in current cultures being used the same way across the board. So they must have been used the same way in the past as well, based on the principle of uniformitarianism. So relational analogies are basically the opposite of a formal analogy. This relies on the relationship between an ethnographic object and an archaeological object. It requires demonstrable evidence between the two. So an example of this would be, we know, actually a really good example is hearth fires. So we can see indigenous people making hearths, making food in them, and how they construct, it's not just a campfire, right? It's a cooking structure, right? Ovens and the like. We can see people making those things, and then what is left behind doesn't always look the same. Some of the rocks might be there, some of the charcoal might be there, maybe some food might be there, but not necessarily the exact same item. So we have to try and figure out what the relationship is between the stuff that's left behind and the actual thing that was in use in the present, right? So we have the ethnographic thing, the thing that's currently in use by modern indigenous folk, right? And then what does that leave behind that allows us to understand essentially the waste product of it that we find in the archaeological record. So that we have to find a link between those things, and that one is a little trickier. That one requires building some sort of string of evidence between the two things and creating examples of it. So you're gonna watch a video. One of the videos that's gonna be posted on the module is about how to what does a in-ground fire, cooking fire, look like archaeologically. What are the different layers? What are the different fractures in the rock? How does it change the chemical consistency of the soil around it? And so that way, if we find that evidence in the archaeological record, we can say, oh, someone must have built a hearth fire here. So hopefully that will make, that one's a little tricky. So hopefully that'll make a little more sense once you watch the videos on ethnography or ethnoarchaeology and taphonomy and experimental archaeology. So to wrap up, right, the whole point of middle range theory is to make some sort of relationship between an object or a feature and then what the cultural purpose of that is, right? So we rely on this principle of uniformitarianism and we use middle range theory as a way to explain the relationship between items in the past and use in the present so that we can understand the use in the past as well. So hopefully that made sense to you. You know, one of the beauties of this whole online learning experience is that you can rewind and re-listen. Of course, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. Yeah, so I think that's it. Feel free to start on the next ones. We're going to do taphonomy, ethnoarchaeology, and experimental archaeology as 3 separate videos, and hopefully that will help make this whole thing make more sense. All right.